When the average person thinks of ancient Egypt, some of the first images that come to mind are King Tutankhamun's golden sarcophagus, mummies, the bust of Nefertiti, and the Great Pyramids of Giza. King Tut's golden mask and Nefertiti's bust both date to the New Kingdom, a golden age in and of its own right. But the Pyramids of Giza date to the first true golden age of ancient Egypt, the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom lasted from 2686 to 2160 BCE, and during this time period, Egypt had numerous trade connections in the Near East and in Nubia. The economy was booming, Egyptian religion was flourishing and continuing to evolve, and most notably, the pharaohs were mobilizing great workforces to build giant pyramids. It is impressive to think of the power the pharaoh had over the people of Egypt to be able to mobilize a massive workforce to build something like the Great Pyramid of Giza. It is almost as if this could only be accomplished by someone who was viewed as a god on earth. But alas, this golden age of pyramids was not to last. In this video, I will be looking at why Old Kingdom Egypt collapsed. We often look at the pyramids of Giza in awe and ask how the ancient Egyptians were able to do that. But what most people don't think about is how much of a drain on resources building the pyramids was. To complete such a monumental building project, an architect was needed, a massive workforce unit leaders, mini towns where the workmen would eat and sleep, quarries for the limestone that was to be used, ships to carry the limestone to Giza, and a whole host of other logistical factors that weren't directly connected to the building of the pyramid itself. In order to obtain such a workforce, a large portion of the agricultural workers had to be pulled away, while in turn more pressure was placed on Egyptian agricultural production to support this massive workforce. Clearly, higher taxes were needed as well to fund these projects. While the Pyramid Age seemed like a golden age from the outside, behind the scenes within the palace, there were a series of crises related to the dynastic succession. Granted, pharaohs had multiple wives, so it is not surprising that there would be inter-palace conflicts over succession. Members within the royal family were fighting for influence and power. Oddly enough, Khafre's successor is not preserved in the king's list or anywhere else in the historic record, which indicates there were problems with succession. Then comes the 5th dynasty, and boy, things really don't get better. The pharaoh Userkaf, who reigned from 2494 to 2487 BCE, presented himself as the founder of a new age who conceived of a new type of government and a new way of kingship. One of the aspects of this new concept of kingship was the emphasis on the sacred character of the pharaoh's pyramid, not the size. Now, one of the roles of the pharaoh was to demonstrate his power and status by building monuments, and while that aspect has not changed, it is still significant that there is less effort to build a truly colossal pyramid by Userkaf. The pyramids of Khufu and Khafre, in addition to being tombs for these respective pharaohs, were meant to project the absolute power and magnificence of said pharaohs. As I said earlier in the video, the fact that Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure were able to mobilize a massive workforce to build these giant structures that housed the king's body after he died showed that these pharaohs had no equal on earth, and nobody within the royal court beneath the king could think of accomplishing something like that. It is not an understatement to say that the pyramids of Giza were a powerful form of propaganda. By the 5th dynasty, it was no longer economically feasible to build giant pyramids, so instead, the pharaohs started building smaller pyramids and sun temples. In fact, more resources were allocated towards building the sun temples than the pyramids. While the pyramids were smaller, the mortuary complexes were lavishly decorated with elaborate painted wall reliefs. It was during this transition to smaller pyramids and sun temples that the pharaoh depicted himself as the son of Ra, hence the sun temples. These actions removed him further from mortals and connected him further with the gods. Something else to consider with these smaller pyramids and sun temples is that because they did not require an immense amount of resources to build, it was easier for other elite individuals or nobles to build their own mortuary complex with pyramids and sun temples. Now, who exactly were these elite individuals who coincided with the decline of the Old Kingdom? To explain, there are 2 points that need to be made to set the background. First, even though, in theory, all of the land within Egypt belonged to the pharaoh, as the one who unites the two lands of Upper and Lower Egypt, in practice, there was private property owned by the nobility. This mode of property ownership by these nobles was actually pretty similar to medieval feudal societies, in that there were peasants that worked the land that was owned by the nobility. The fact that elite individuals from either within the pharaoh's administration or the priesthood could own large swaths of land allowed them to gain more wealth that allowed them to build their own elaborate tombs. There was also a wider inheritance of these estates and wealth, which leads to the second point. During his reign, Userkaf went against the tradition of royal officials only being of royal birth and allowed those of non-royal birth to be royal officials. There were other 5th dynasty reforms that distanced the royal family from high-up government offices. This ended up creating a massive bureaucracy and new class of elite careerist bureaucrats who would end up taking control of the Egyptian government. In the same way the other nobility had their own tombs, this new class of elite bureaucrats, thanks to the wealth gained from their position and the fact that they were running the Egyptian government, could build their own tombs with sophisticated art and architecture. They also built their tombs away from the pharaoh's tomb, which is another break from tradition, where originally the pharaoh's tomb was surrounded by the tombs of various royal family members and nobles. This is an indication of the pharaoh's weakening power and influence, because these new bureaucratic elites were influential enough to build their tombs in their own sacred area, and they no longer needed to build them near the king's tomb. Not only were these elite government officials able to build tombs that were as sophisticated as the king's, they were also recording their exploits and accomplishments on their own stele. The elite government officials' ability to do these things made it clear that the pharaoh no longer had a monopoly on power and influence within ancient Egypt. The pharaoh's image as a god on earth, who had absolute power over everyone else, was now being threatened. The king attempted to reduce their influence, but that only led to a weakening of the central government. Anytime the central government is weakened in any state, that inevitably leads to decentralization. Something else to keep in mind with regards to the estates the nobles and bureaucratic elite owned is that because the lands were tax exempt, the pharaoh not only lost more sources of tax revenue, it also meant that the nobility were the ones with the most influence on these lands, which further accelerated decentralization. Ancient Egypt had been a centralized state since Lower and Upper Egypt were united by the pharaoh Narmer. As such, the king, his court, and the social elite were firmly located in the capital of Memphis. The institutions of the state religion were located close to the capital, but in the 5th and 6th dynasties, provincial administrators were put in charge of single nomes and took up permanent residence within their respective nome. These positions of nomarchs were also hereditary. One of the consequences of this change was that the provincial officials and nobles residing within these provinces had direct access to the products of Egypt. This, along with the nobility gaining more tax-exempt land, as previously stated, and climatic issues, caused the pharaoh's economic power to be greatly weakened, which meant that he could no longer perform the role assigned to him by the kingship doctrine. As for the climatic issues, there was a decline in precipitation, followed by a series of low Nile inundations. The low Nile floods resulted in less crop yields, which meant even less tax revenue, not to mention famine. Some scholars argue that the low Nile floods were caused by climate change, resulting from the end of the Neolithic wet phase. By the end of the 5th dynasty, once again, we have an issue with succession. The pharaoh Unas dies without a male heir to the throne. Then along comes Teti, who comes to the throne by marrying Unas's daughter, thus beginning the 6th dynasty. Teti ruled from 2345 BCE to 2323 BCE, when he was possibly assassinated in a palace plot. The usurper was Userkara, who only ruled from 2323 to 2321 BCE, and was then succeeded by Pepi I. There is some debate on whether Userkara was a legitimate or illegitimate ruler, but the archaeological evidence seems to indicate that he was an illegitimate usurper. He is not mentioned in any tomb inscriptions or biographies of officials who served during the reigns of Teti and Pepi I. Regardless, Pepi I was the successor to the throne. Unsurprisingly for this chaotic time period, there was another assassination attempt on the pharaoh, Pepi in this case, but it was thwarted by a member of the palace administration, Weni. The story of Weni's rise up the ranks of the royal administration is a notable example of how during the end of the Old Kingdom, the expansion of government positions allowed individuals who were close to the royal court to advance to higher up positions. Weni started off as a storehouse custodian and eventually became an overseer of the robing room in the palace harem. It was during his time in this position that he prevented and exposed the assassination attempt on Pepi I, which was reported to the pharaoh. He was then appointed as a judge and put in charge of initiating judicial proceedings against the queen and the conspirators in the harem. Eventually, Weni became the governor of Upper Egypt, and according to the inscription of Weni, he governed the south to the pharaoh's satisfaction, and Pepi praised Weni for his watchfulness and vigilance. The inscription of Weni reflects how during the 5th and 6th dynasties, rather than positions within the Egyptian government being hereditary, individuals were chosen based on qualities the pharaoh noticed. While there was internal chaos during the decline of the Old Kingdom, there were foreign military threats as well. The autobiography of Weni talks of numerous rebellions by groups of nomadic Bedouins from the northeast known as the Sand Dwellers that he was sent out with an army to crush. In Nubia, there was an influx of new settlers known as the Sea Group, whose center was at Kerma. Eventually, local chiefs gained power in Lower Nubia, a region Egypt had economic interest in, due to the numerous luxury goods this region gave Egypt access to. This resulted in several military clashes between the Egyptians and Nubians. There are instances of members of the Egyptian caravans being killed by Nubians and Asiatics. Clearly, by this point in Egyptian history, Egypt did not intimidate these foreign adversaries. Some scholars put forward the hypothesis that the economy of Old Kingdom Egypt was so heavily dependent on foreign trade that incursions beyond Egypt's northern and southern frontier affected trade with the Levant and Nubia, contributing to the decline of Old Kingdom Egypt. Pepi I was succeeded by Merenra, who ruled for 9 years, and then Pepi II, who ruled for 6 decades. Pepi II's long reign led to more succession issues, since he outlived many heirs to the throne. The second half of his reign was largely ineffective. During this time, local provincial officials were gaining more power and influence. One example of such a provincial official was Pepiank, who among other titles was a vizier of Mir. In his tomb, he had a massive list of dignitaries, which demonstrates his elite position within society. In addition, the tomb of officials like Pepiank had decorations and wall reliefs that were on par with the pharaoh's. After Pepi II's reign, the ancient Egyptian throne saw 17 kings within 20 years. According to Manetho, the 7th dynasty, which was the dynasty that followed Pepi II's reign, saw 70 kings for 70 days, though this is likely an exaggeration. Nonetheless, this is a reflection of the fact that after Pepi II died, Egypt descends into essentially political anarchy. The provincial nobles take control, and central authority within Egypt collapses, which leads to fragmentation between Lower and Upper Egypt. The collapse of central authority and splitting of Egypt between Lower and Upper Egypt marks the end of the Old Kingdom and the beginning of the first intermediate period. The center of power in Lower Egypt was in Heracleopolis, ruled by the House of Aktoi. Initially, the House of Aktoi had control over a united Egypt, but around 2140 BCE, Thebes and other towns in Upper Egypt break away from Heracleopolis. Thebes was now the head city and center of power within the rebel state of Upper Egypt. Both Heracleopolis and Thebes replaced Memphis as the capital cities of their respective regions, and the Memphite family of kings had completely disappeared. In addition, the first intermediate period saw local nomarchs like Ankh-Tifi making claims of glory. Specifically with Ankh-Tifi, he claims that he gave bread to the hungry and took care of the towns of Hor-Mer and Hefat, implying that he was able to overcome crises such as famine. Ankh-Tifi is also given titles such as Overseer of Priests in Desert Countries and Great Overlord of Edfu and Harakan Polis. The fact that a nomarch such as Ankh-Tifi can make these claims demonstrates that the days when the pharaoh was the most powerful man in all of Egypt were gone, not to return until the Middle Kingdom. The days of Zoser, Khufu, and Khafre were over.